right now. And now I'll introduce our speaker. Dr. Elizabeth Rajuszewski is an associate research scientist at START, where she co-leads the Global Responses to Asymmetric Threats project. Her research focuses on irregular warfare, international rivalries, foreign policy, and creativity and innovation. Elizabeth, you can go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Erin, for a great introduction. Thank you everyone for coming to my talk. Just want to share the screen. So in 2010, General Petraeus, who was the leading architect of the counterinsurgency approach in Iraq that emphasized focus on population protection, the hearts and minds approach, was asked about the role of private contractors in conflict. And he remarked that contracting security services represents both an opportunity and a danger. And I think for a very long time, when we thought about the use of private contractors in conflict, we consider them to be very dangerous, very irresponsible, sort of cowboy-like behavior, having no rules, using indiscriminate force against civilians. But I think that over the years, we started to focus more on how can we better understand conditions under which private contractors can actually offer benefits to governments that work with these actors. And so in the past couple of years, we started to collect more data to understand some of the patterns of behavior and consequences of using contractors. And this book project and the talk that I'm having right now is basically an outcome of trying to systematically understand conditions under which private contractors can be useful to governments that hire them. So why focus on PMSCs? Why is there an interest in understanding their impact on conflict dynamics? There clearly is a national security interest in using contractors. They provide several benefits to governments. So I just wanted to briefly describe those benefits. They provide military and security services, anything from protection of personnel, protection of buildings, embassies, which is something we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, combat assistance, protection of military convoys, training of police, training of the military, logistics, assistance with intelligence gathering, communications, consultancy. And even more recently, we've seen contractors assisting governments with cyber defense operations. So contractors can be very useful to governments in fulfilling a lot of these national security needs. But there are also political benefits. So we know from research that, at least in the US context, when it comes to troop casualties, the public is very sensitive to that, which makes it difficult for leaders to deploy troops in situations that may require our attention, but nevertheless, we don't have that political opportunity to do so because of public constraints. Now, when it comes to private contractors, it's quite different. So research shows that the public is quite indifferent to the death of contractors, even if those contractors are American citizens, which gives leaders potentially some benefits when it comes to utilizing contractors in very dangerous conflict situations. So contractors have been utilized extensively, not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I know those are the cases that everybody is familiar with, but they've been also utilized in Africa. So for example, the Africa Command Center has utilized contractors in its counterinsurgency, counterterrorism missions in the Sahel region. Contractors have assisted with the training of military forces in that area. They've also helped the United States deal with counter-narcotics missions in collaboration with Colombia and Mexico. So quite extensive use of contractors beyond the Iraqi and Afghanistan conflict zones. And on the right side, I wanted to show you illustrations to highlight over the years the number of conflicts that contractors have been involved in. And you can see the first graph shows the presence of contractors in major conflicts. Those are conflicts that involve at least 1,000 battle deaths. They usually involve fighting that has a characteristic of an insurgency, a guerrilla warfare, as well as some conventional fighting. So these are very intense conflicts in terms of generating high number of casualties. And you can see that starting with 1990s, there's been an increase in the presence of contractors in conflict zones. And then post 1990, a decrease. But if you look at the second illustration, you can see that you see an increase in the presence of contractors in minor conflicts. And those are essentially conflicts with at least 25 battle deaths. So we have a lower threshold for casualties in the minor conflicts. And post 2000, you see an increase in the presence of contractors in those conflict zones. So I wanted to explain a little bit about what kind of contractors I'm actually focusing on in this project, because the world of private military and security contractors is quite vast. So we have mercenaries, which I think a lot of people are familiar with, freelance soldiers that will work for anybody and pretty much do anything. You have your ad hoc PMSCs, which are basically corporate organizations that may pop up to temporarily fulfill some kind of a contractual obligation for a very specific project. They don't really have a perspective to stay on the market for a long time. And then you have the world of international PMSCs. And that world can be divided into two types of contractors. Those that obviously operate globally, but are very dependent on the state, very connected to the state. So today we often think of Russia's Wagner Group as an example of that. And then you have independent international PMCs that provide services globally to government. And those are basically internationally operating, legally registered corporate entities that do have a business structure. So they have certain business hierarchies, like they have a CEO, they have managers, they have lower level employees, and they provide military and security services for monetary compensation. These independent international PMCs are essentially businesses that provide services to governments. They tend to work for Western governments like the United States and the UK. And those are the PMCs that are the subject of my analysis and the focus of this presentation. So then the question is, why am I focusing on that particular subset of contractors? There's several reasons for that. First, they're of interest to Western governments because Western governments cannot work with mercenaries, for example, because the use of mercenaries is actually illegal under international law. Independent international PMCs also have a lot of experience and expertise in delivering high quality services. So they're preferred by Western governments. They tend to have slightly better accountability record, though even within that context, there is variation. Second, I would argue that it's easier to actually collect data on the activities of international PMSCs because they tend to leave more trace behind when it comes to their activities. It's a little bit harder to track the presence and the type of services that are provided by mercenaries. They're not impossible, and we're seeing some efforts right now. Some scholars are collecting data on the presence of mercenaries, but I would argue when it comes to data reliability, still a little bit more confidence when it comes to collecting data on international PMSCs. So as a result, I focused in the project on these contractors. I also want to mention that international PMSCs have a little bit of a different incentive when it comes to surviving on the market. So mercenaries, they can be here one day and then they can be gone the next day. The same thing with ad hoc PMSCs. But international PMSCs have a long-term perspective. They want to secure services for a long time from clients. And that has implications for the way in which they will behave, which I will explain in a moment. So a little bit more constraints in terms of behavior for these companies than for mercenaries that basically don't have a long-term perspective of staying on the market. So within the world of private military and security companies and the clients that work with them, the governments, what are some of the concerns that governments have had? Specifically, what are some of the concerns of the US government? First, How can we improve the effectiveness of companies? What are the conditions under which PMMCs can help terminate conflicts and improve post-conflict stability? And second, how can we improve the ethical issues concerning the use of private military and security companies in conflicts? So for a long time, we've had these concerns about PMMCs, abusing civilians, and there have been a lot of prominent cases in Iraq and Afghanistan that contractors were using force in an indiscriminate manner and undermining the U.S. hearts and minds approach, right, alienating the locals and undermining overall mission in Iraq and Afghanistan. So how can we minimize the harm that contractors are causing? How can we reduce the instances of fraud, lots of fraud committed by contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan? And so I would argue that if we address the question of ethics, we also address the question of effectiveness. And in a moment, I'm going to explain how these two are very much connected and what are some of the ways in which we could understand how contractors can improve their effectiveness in conflict zones with positive contributions to governments. Okay, so I wanted to explain the core of my argument. First, I want to argue that the competitive market that private military and security companies are a part of has implications on their behavior, on how militarily effective they will be. If PMSCs are militarily effective, it means they are accountable to the governments. And if they are accountable to the governments, we should expect that they will help governments achieve considerable gains against insurgents. So we should see a shift in the balance of power favoring the governments. And the outcome of this should be contribution to the termination of war. We should expect that under these conditions where contractors are militarily effective, we should expect that conflicts should be terminated faster. So in this project, I focus on a very specific dimension of military effectiveness. Now we know that military effectiveness is of course about skill. And there's been some research done on the kind of skills that help contractors be more successful. So I'm not looking into this because that has already been covered. Instead, I'm focusing on this dimension of military effectiveness that I refer to as corporate professionalism. And corporate professionalism is basically a set of values that define the mission of a company. These values will impact the kind of policies that companies have for their employees, how they handle their mission in conflict zones. So for example, are CEOs of PMSCs pushing for training of their employees to become more comfortable with different cultures? Do they understand how to interact with local populations in a conflict zone? Are they emphasizing the use of light weapons to minimize the risk of indiscriminate use of force against civilians? Do they have policies that consider a very thorough vetting of personnel to minimize instances of fraud, to minimize the risk of having individuals with problematic past enter the company and therefore maybe be connected to human rights abuses down the road? So emphasis on corporate professionalism means that you promote integrity, right? It means that you fulfill contractual obligations for the client. You reduce instances of fraud. Now, how is this related to military effectiveness? In Iraq, we know that billions of dollars were squandered by military contractors on projects that were promised but never delivered, personnel that was hired that was not qualified to do the job. Right? All of this is an example of fraudulent behavior, and it can have a negative consequences on the success of the mission. Second, protection of individuals, respect of international humanitarian laws is also an element of corporate professionalism. The idea that you want to respect the local culture, that you want to honor human rights, if that is something that's important for the company, that can contribute to military effectiveness as well. Why? Because we know in insurgencies, respecting the locals is very important for shaping the perceptions that locals have of the government. If you're alienating the locals, essentially you're turning them away from the government and into the hands of the insurgents. So now they become supporters of insurgents. And research shows that in most cases of insurgencies, not all, but in most cases of insurgencies, massive human rights abuses are actually undermining government's efforts. So PMSCs that score high on this dimension of corporate professionalism should be more militarily effective and therefore help governments achieve greater benefit in ending the conflict. So what explains variation in companies' approach to corporate professionalism on these two dimensions? Well, I argue that competitive pressure plays a big role. And I want to talk a little bit about dynamics of competitive pressure that play a role in this. First, companies may face what I refer to as a local competition. So imagine that there is a conflict zone and governments are choosing to work with just one PMSC. That PMC in that given conflict has no competition. It's the sole provider of services as a company. And it means that if a company is in a complex conflict zone and it alienates the locals, it may get away with doing so, right? There is this problem with monitoring contractors in the field. And so how do we improve that? Well, one way to think about improving that is to introduce monitoring in the conflict zone. And I argue that we can do that by actually increasing the number of security providers so that there is a mechanism of peer monitoring. In other words, companies monitor each other. Now, why would they do that? Well, they do that because they want to be more successful long-term in achieving support from the clients. They want to renew their contracts. They want to get new contracts. And if they can get a competitive edge by showing that a rival company is not fulfilling contractual obligations, by, let's say, committing some kind of abuses against the locals, if they can provide that information to the client, that can benefit them in the bidding stage at some point in the future. So they can exploit that potentially in their favor. Second, through my interviews with employees of PMSCs, I also learned that monitoring what other companies are doing is a matter of safety. Because if one company employees, for example, engage in some kind of abusive behavior towards the locals, it can have negative consequences on the security of personnel of another PMSC. So you may also keep an eye on what others are doing for that particular reason. And so I would argue that if companies know that there is this informal mechanism of peer monitoring, it can potentially alter their behavior, make them more likely to now be very careful about how they approach the locals, be more careful about fulfilling the services that they promise. So increasing competition at the local level, at the conflict level, should help increase military effectiveness of companies and benefit the governments with the outcome of shorter conflict duration. Second, we also have competition at the global level. Now, what is a global level? Global level is essentially competition at the industry level. And over the years, we've seen that a lot of PMSCs entered the market. So a lot of people established these companies. And so in order to respond to this pressure, competitive pressure from having a lot of providers, companies needed to find a way to differentiate themselves from their competitors. And how did they do that? Well, some of them approached their business practice by altering their corporate structure. And I'm going to argue that this particular action, altering your business structure, has had, in some instances, positive impact on improving military effectiveness of companies by improving their corporate professionalism. So just to give you an idea of what exactly happened with changes in corporate structure. Well, some companies needed to acquire capital in order to diversify their services. Because if you can diversify your services, you can potentially be very attractive to governments and provide a lot of services in different areas. But that's obviously very expensive for companies to do. So in order to acquire capital, some PMSCs altered their structure and went public. So they became publicly traded companies. And you can see on this graph that in 1998 is the first time we're seeing actually PMSCs changing their corporate structure. And you saw this upward trend up to 2008, which is the cutoff point for my data collection. So this has been a response to this growing competitive pressure at the global level, at the industry level. Now, this has had positive implications for how companies operate. For those companies that have gone public, we have seen an improvement in their corporate professionalism. Why? Because these companies are now accountable to a large number of shareholders. And if companies are tied to scandals related to fraud, related to human rights abuses, this really generates a lot of negative publicity. Media coverage tends to be much greater for publicly traded companies than it is for private companies. So greater media coverage means a lot more negative publicity for companies, which is not good when you're bidding for a contract. It is also not good when it comes to potentially losing support of your shareholders. So I'm not saying that it's impossible for publicly traded PMSCs to recover from scandals. I'm just saying it's harder to recover for them than it is for private PMSCs that are only accountable to a small number of shareholders. So because of this, I would argue that publicly traded companies are much more risk averse when it comes to these kinds of behaviors related to fraud and related to human rights abuses. And this has pushed these companies to improve their corporate professionalism. And as a result, the argument is that improves military effectiveness and provides benefits for governments when it comes to reducing conflict duration. So let me just summarize the two key arguments that I'm making in this project. First, again, is the impact of local competition on military effectiveness and conflict termination. By increasing competition at the local level, hiring more than one company, the governments are introducing enhanced monitoring. It's informal, peer monitoring that I would argue leads to greater military effectiveness and contributes to conflict termination, because companies now have to consider the possibility, have to expect that a rival company might serve as a whistleblower. Now, it doesn't mean that a rival company will always serve as a whistleblower, but just the mere possibility that it could, the expectation that it could, might be sufficient for companies to be more careful about their behavior in a conflict zone. Second argument was that the impact of global competition on military effectiveness has been positive in that it has pushed some companies to respond to growing competition by altering their business structure, going public. And this step of altering corporate business structure has contributed to a more risk-averse behavior when it comes to human rights abuses, when it comes to committing fraud by some PMSCs, which then has had positive has led to a positive contribution for the government and shorter conflicts. So now I wanted to describe the data that I used to test these arguments. So the cases that I have include all civil wars from 1990 up until 2008. These civil wars are mostly insurgencies in my data set, so they contain elements of guerrilla warfare. They may have some conventional warfare as well. I have conflicts that are major wars and minor wars, so I test my argument on two types of conflicts. Major wars are those that have 1,000 battle deaths, and minor wars that have at least 25 battle deaths. So it's a lower casualty threshold for minor conflicts. The data that I collected for this project was on interventions by international PMSCs, and the data looked at the level of competition. So how many companies have intervened in a given conflict year over the years. I have also looked at the kind of services that these companies have provided. And I've also looked at the corporate structure of the companies, whether they're publicly traded or not. And in my statistical analysis, I do take into consideration a variety of different alternative explanations that could account for shorter conflicts, explain conflict duration. So things such as proportion of government forces to rebel forces, the type of terrain in the conflict zone, a governing system, the type of services that I mentioned that PMCs provide, ethnic diversity, and several other control variables. So I wanted to share with you the insights from my findings. First, looking at the impact of local competition in major conflicts. Remember, those are the conflicts that have at least 1,000 battle deaths. They will involve elements of insurgency and conventional fighting. And here I find support for my argument that increasing competition, working with more than one provider, offers benefits to the government in that it contributes to shorter duration of conflicts. And the argument is that competitive pressure improves corporate professionalism, right? This idea of informal monitoring raises the standards of performance for companies and provides more gains to the government. And I just wanted to mention that, you know, one can argue that this has nothing to do with competition, right? That maybe this finding is all about the fact that government gets support from multiple companies, right? So it gets lots of resources. So in a way, it's expected, right? It's expected that we should see shorter duration because government is working with, let's say, 5 companies. So it has more resources than just working with one company. And so certainly my co-author and I took that into consideration, and we controlled for that. So we actually analyzed the number of services that each company provided in a given conflict year. And we also introduced the separate variable of competition. And when we ran the analysis, we still found that competition was statistically significant, which tells us that it's not just the accumulation of resources that's helping the government, but it's also the separate mechanism of accountability, this informal competitive mechanism that adds value to the company's performance. Now, how big is this effect? So I wanted to show you this dynamic, explain this dynamic using a scenario where we can consider 3 cases. So 3 scenarios. Let's examine what happens in 3 cases where we assume the conflict dynamic, conflict complexity is the same in all 3 cases. And the only thing that we are changing is whether the government works with a PMSC, whether the government works with no PMCs, 1 PMC, or multiple PMCs. Okay, so 3 scenarios here. Those are the only things we're changing. Everything else is constant about the conflict. And let's see what happens. So in this illustration on the slide, you see that on the right side, we have the odds that the conflict will continue past the 5th year when the government has not hired any PMSCs for assistance. And the odds of the conflict continuing past the 5th year is pretty high, right? It's almost over 80% that we will see more conflict. Now let's see what happens when the government works with just 1 private military and security company. So that is the middle bar, which shows no competition, right? So just 1 PMSC is assisting the government. No other providers are on the ground, security providers. Here you can see the odds of conflict continuing past the 5th year, still pretty high, right? Almost no difference from the scenario I just described, 80%. Right? Very minimal gain for the government here. Now let's look at what happens when the government works with multiple providers. So in this particular case, 5 PMSCs have joined the government's efforts. Now we see that the odds of the conflict continuing past the 5th year are decreasing. and they're at about 50%. So sure, the conflict still goes on, but we can see that there is a considerable gain now comparing to the two previous scenarios. So now let me talk about what happens when I analyzed the impact of local competition in the context of minor conflicts. Here, we don't find support that local competition makes a difference. And this seemed very puzzling to me. And so what is going on with minor conflicts? Remember, those are the conflicts with at least 25 battalists, so they have lower number of casualties. So when I played around with my analysis, what I was able to find is that actually the cases where multiple PMCs are hired by the governments, those are the cases that have high level of local competition, are actually the cases which involve the most complex conflict zones. Okay, those are the cases where conflicts will have multiple rebel groups. Those are the cases in which rebels are relying on natural resources to finance themselves. Those are the cases when you will have a lot of terrorist attacks, very difficult to resolve conflict. And in those conflicts, when multiple PMSCs are hired, it doesn't look like they're making a difference for the government. And I would argue that it's not because local competition is failing to hold them somehow accountable. Rather, in spite of the benefits that local competition provides in raising the standard of performance on that level of corporate professionalism, companies are still struggling. And what this is showing to us is that conflict dynamics play a vital role in understanding also the effectiveness of companies. It is not just raising the standard of their performance, holding them accountable, improving their corporate professionalism, or improving the skill. We also have to consider how complex the conflict is. And in the most difficult conflict environments, they're struggling, just like the governments. So now I want to turn to the findings related to the impact of global competition. So recall that I was arguing global competition has pushed some companies to become publicly traded PMSCs. And I argued that this has had a positive impact on improving gains for the government. So publicly traded companies, my finding shows, are much more likely to help governments, and they contribute to actually shorter conflict duration. And why? The explanation, as I mentioned before, it's because of greater accountability that these companies face due to media pressure, large number of shareholders, and greater impact, negative impact associated with connection to scandals, fraudulent behavior, human rights abuses that could truly hurt these companies financially in the long run. So they are much more cautious in how they behave, and this is improving their performance in conflict zones and helping the governments. Now, I'm only able to show you findings in the context of minor conflicts, those that have 25 battle deaths, because at the time of the data collection, I did not have any companies that were publicly traded that intervened in major conflicts, the ones that had at least 1,000 battles. So I was not able, as of 2008, to test that argument in the major conflict data set. So overall, findings suggest that improving competition at the local level is very useful for governments, increasing the number of PMCs that you work with in conflicts that have a lot of casualties, that have some element of insurgency and conventional warfare. Those are the conflicts that will have at least 1,000 battle deaths. In those contexts, we see that PMSCs are performing well when we improve or increase competition. And that is a contributing factor for the governments to experience more success in those kinds of contexts. We also see that when it comes to most difficult conflict dynamics, PMCs are struggling, okay? And finally, we do see that working with publicly traded PMSCs offers benefits to governments and is associated with shorter conflict duration. So I want to conclude my presentation with 4 policy recommendations coming from this research. First, the idea about the power of competitive forces works as long as the client actually holds companies responsible for their behavior. If companies don't think that there will be any negative consequences for, let's say, being caught committing violations against civilians, and let's say a rival company reports that to the media or the client, and there are no consequences. In other words, their contract gets to be renewed, the mechanism falls apart, right? There is no benefit then to increasing competitive pressure because the client simply doesn't do anything about punishing companies that violate a contract. So it's very important that clients do take responsibility and actually consciously choose not to work with companies that are connected to these abuses. Now, this may seem like an obvious thing, but we know that at least in the early stages of the Iraq War, companies that did commit abuses got their contracts renewed. So it does happen. It does happen. And so it's really important for clients to understand that they play a role in making the market dynamics work in a way that actually improves military effectiveness of companies. Second, recommendation is that governments should probably work with multiple PMSCs. If you have a choice and a company offers you a discount on a bundle of services, which is now very likely to happen because companies can offer multiple services. One company can do lots of things for governments. And so that may look like a great deal, right? Cost-saving deal. But my study shows that this actually may undermine accountability. So governments would benefit from dividing contracts among multiple security providers if they would like to see greater military gains and improvements in conflict dynamics for their end. 3, there should be more emphasis on non-cost factors when evaluating companies for contract awards. So obviously in the bidding stage, there's emphasis on cost, there's emphasis on technical ability, but I think to some extent we need to emphasize a little bit more these non-cost factors. Those are the kind of things that might benefit publicly traded companies. So while it would be discriminatory for clients to say we only want to work with publicly traded companies, and we know that these companies perform better, based on the study, they perform better and offer more benefits to governments. Nevertheless, governments can create some criteria that may benefit publicly traded companies at a bidding stage. Things such as maybe looking at whether there has been any connection in the media or any coverage in the media that ties companies to some kind of allegations related to human rights abuses or fraud. And that could be a factor that might be considered when thinking about awarding companies contracts or deciding which company should get a contract. And lastly, any steps that we take to improve ability of companies to actually fulfill contractual obligations, right, and to reduce their opportunistic behavior requires not only improvements in regulation, and we have a lot of formal mechanisms that regulate industry. I argued in this project informal mechanism of regulation in the form of pure competition is very useful as well. But study shows that even when we improve regulation of companies, there may still be situations where companies are not able to provide enough for the government to actually turn the conflict around. And those are the cases that involve the most difficult conflict environments. Cases that governments to this day struggle with. And the research shows that even when companies do fulfill contractual obligations, do what the government asks them to do, they may still not be able to provide enough to be successful. So I think we need to understand the limitations and set our expectations at a realistic level, and not think that as long as we improve regulation of the industry, right, we're going to get all of these massive benefits. Yes, we can in some conflict environments, but we also need to understand that there are still conflict environments that are particularly difficult to address, even when the professionalism is at a very high level. And with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was fantastic. As a reminder to our participants, you're welcome to drop a question in the Q&A if you have a question. I'll note that we do have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, but we'll get to as many questions in that time as possible. We do already have a couple of questions in the Q&A. So Elizabeth, first, are PMSCs still active in Iraq? And if so, do they mostly provide security primarily for American companies?
Yes, there are still some contractors left in Iraq. I believe the number is less than 3,000, but maybe a little bit even less right now. That was last time I checked, which was a couple of months ago. So yes, there are still some contractors that are present there. We do still have some of our forces in Iraq, a very small number and just special operations. And so these contractors are assisting in those with those missions. So yes, we have some left. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And do governments such as the Iraqi government hire PMSCs, or are they hired by the US military?
Yes, so yeah, Iraqi government, yes, and there have been cases where Iraqi government has had its own actually companies, and I didn't mention this. Governments have their own domestic companies that provide all kinds of security and military services. But I really have not focused on those in my research because they don't operate globally. So I would argue they don't have the same level of long-term perspective of survival on the market. So they may not have the same concerns about upholding certain standards for the client simply because they're usually operating on ad hoc basis. And so that creates different behavioral incentives. So I have not studied those companies, but certainly, yes, in Iraq, you would have Iraqi companies. In Afghanistan, there were Afghan private military and security companies as well that provided services, and the US government provided resources to those companies and contracted with those companies as well. Yes.
Okay. And how do PMSCs operating in the same country, how are they able to monitor each other?
Well, people know each other. No, yeah, it's true. You can have individuals who might work for a few years with one company and they work with another company. So they have an understanding of what everybody is doing. It's informal, right? So it's not like the government is telling every provider what everybody's role is, unless they're, of course, working on a joint mission, which sometimes that does happen, like in Liberia, for example, when two companies, DynCorp and Pacific Architect Engineers, were hired with post-conflict stability mission to fulfill post-conflict stability missions. They actually were working together, and so obviously they would know what is the responsibility of the other. So that creates a lot of clarity. In other contexts, it's going to be informal. It's going to be, okay, I'm friends with these people. I know what they're doing. We're talking, right? More informal understanding of what the companies are doing. Certainly, if you are going and harming the locals, right? That's pretty obvious, right? Word is going to spread about that. So a lot of it is informal information sharing about what the companies are doing.
Sure. Okay, so I do have a bit of a lengthy question. Let me see. Are there differences in qualitative outcomes in conflicts besides the probability of an extended conflict, such as social stability, sturdy democratization, health improvements, decreasing inequality, when PMSCs are involved versus when they are not?
Great question. We are actually certainly working to gather more data on this. I mean, the whole idea of empirical analysis of PMSCs behavior and consequences of their actions is an open field right now. I can tell you just one finding coming from a different research I conducted, and that was looking at the impact on post-conflict stability, looking at the duration of peace. So maybe that will speak to this question. In another study, I had analyzed how different types of interventions of PMSCs affect the extent to which peace can last longer in some conflicts than in others. And here I found that how you intervene matters, right? So if PMSCs are training the forces of the government rather than taking over the job of the forces in many ways, conflict stability, post-conflict stability is actually lasting longer. And that sort of makes sense, right? Because they're increasing the capacity of the government to manage any kind of post-conflict instability. When PMSCs are training the forces, they're actually building up the force of the government. So it's more sustainable in the post-conflict environment. After the contractors leave, governmental forces can now handle this on their own. If they're just kind of substituting, right? If they're hired and doing the job for the government and not providing the training, what we see is that this has actually negative consequences. In other words, it doesn't help the government sustain post-conflict stability. So yes, so that's one area of research I can comment on. We don't have quantitative insights on the impact of other areas. Qualitative, we have some cases that look at the stability of governments. I think there have been some studies that have looked at what happens to democracy and possibilities of coups, and that interventions of PMCs might weaken the stability of the government. It creates also sometimes resentment from the armed forces and creates conflict between the government and the armed forces. So we have some qualitative insights on that it may be destabilizing, but to the best of my knowledge, no empirical studies, just some insights on this from a qualitative perspective. Yes, so that would be what I've seen so far.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, in your research, have you looked at PMSCs that work with multinationals?
No, I have not. There are people who have collected data. I haven't, because I haven't collected data on this. When this project first started, initially I collected data only on the African context, and that was a tremendous undertaking. Over the years, I extended it to other contexts, which is the outcome of this book. And recently we are seeing people collecting actually data on mercenaries and PMSCs who have intervened or have assisted, multinationals who are working with all kinds of non-governmental organizations. So actors other than states. In my project, I've only looked at states. I did look at the rebels. I didn't mention it in the project just because I didn't want to overwhelm you with tons of information, but I can just let you know that instances of international PMSCs actually working for the rebels are very rare. And that's not surprising because it's not considered good for your reputation if you assist the rebels. So international PMSCs prefer to work for the governments. Mercenaries, of course, are working for the rebels. They are just working for anyone who offers them good financial rewards. So I don't have any data to comment on in terms of assistance to multinationals, but I know the data on this does exist, and I think some people are starting to do some empirical work on this right now.
Great. And as a reminder for our audience, I do have the link to Elizabeth's book in the chat. If you want to go and check that out, you're of course welcome to, if you'd like more information. So our next question is, how can legislation be used so that PMSCs are incentivized to go public? And why is it considered discriminatory for governments to only work with public PMSCs?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if you can legislate something like that, right? It's a decision. Of a company how they want to structure their business, and so I think that if we get into having government legislate that, right, I would imagine tremendous pushback. So I don't think we're likely to see that. That sort of would take away the whole idea of private actors, having the freedom to decide how they want to essentially structure their businesses. So I don't think that that would be a way to go. I think the incentive is to simply reward companies that are taking measures to improve their corporate professionalism. And publicly traded companies are more likely to do that, just because they already have these risks that they're facing if they're tied to abuses. And so I think if we emphasize more that we value corporate professionalism and we want to see more improvements in that area, that can create even more incentive for companies to go public, because now they can see that the value of going public isn't just coming from acquiring more resources to diversify their services, but also because the client appreciates and rewards them when they have taken on this difficult undertaking of being more accountable as a publicly traded company. So I think that by emphasizing these kinds of non-cost factors, that can be a better incentive than sort of formally regulating companies. That would be my take on it. I also want to mention that the US has already done a lot, US government has already done a lot to improve companies' corporate professionalism. For example, in order to be working for the DoD, you need to be certified with standards, international standards for private military and security contractors. And these standards actually require that companies show how they can meet challenges related to human rights protection and conflict. The problem with this is that, as you can imagine, it's one thing to show that you can meet these challenges. It's quite another thing to actually follow through on those when you are doing the job, when you are in the conflict zone. And that's why I believe that just the standards, right, that governments are requiring, these certifications, may not be sufficient. And so things like publicly traded companies, they have their own incentive to follow through, not just showing that they have the capacity to uphold the standards in treating people with dignity and respect in the conflict zone, but they will actually follow through on that when they are hired in the conflict zone. And I think that can be, you can encourage companies to do more of that by showing that this matters in the bidding stage, and that's a big factor. So yeah, I think I created a very long answer to possibly ask a simple question, but I wouldn't think that legislation is the way to go, because I think that would go against the whole idea of what private businesses do and the freedom that they have to operate as they want.
Great, thank you. We're of course very happy to have your expertise on the subject.
Thank you, Erin.
Oh, this is a great question. So someone's asking, how can they reach out to you to learn more about your work?
Oh, thanks so much. So I guess, Erin, if you can maybe provide a link to my email in the chat. Feel free to email me. I'd love to connect, answer any questions you have, or just share any more insights.
And just dropped your email in the chat. And of course, that goes for the rest of our audience as well. I know Elizabeth has said that she's more than happy if you have any other questions or if you'd like to follow up with her, you're more than welcome to. And that brings us to the end of our questions. And our timing is almost perfect. So I'll say, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm really grateful for the comments and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yes. Everyone, thank you for joining us. If you like this event, then please feel free to check out one of our upcoming events. We have another one upcoming on April 26th about foreign influence operations, in case you're curious about that. But otherwise, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you for the next event.